Good day, colleagues. My name is Sheona Shackleton and I work at the African Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town. I'll be talking about changing land use patterns we're seeing in South Africa, the drivers of these changes and their consequences and implications. I'll start by taking us through the purpose and structure of this talk, but before that I'd just like to read out this quote. Over 500,000 households in South Africa's former homelands disengaged from farming between 2011 and 2016. This represents a loss of 1 in 5 crop farming households. And it is this that provides the context for my talk. However, I'll focus much more on the local scale and provide additional evidence and insights into this concerning trend. The aim of my talk is to synthesize findings from several studies across South Africa in order to understand the observed shift away from field cultivation, but also other land use changes in the communal areas of the country. We really need to be doing more of this work because there's been inadequate consideration of the rates and scales of field deactivation and what land use changes more widely, the livelihood, food security and ecological consequences of these changes. Also the use of interdisciplinary research and multiple methodologies and data sources to build a comprehensive picture of the changes that are taking place, particularly because this is so complex. And then what these changes mean for rural development and agrarian policy in a time of increased vulnerability and global change. Regarding the structure of my talk, I'll start by providing evidence of the changes and trends in land use patterns, then consider how this translates to changes in livelihood portfolios, explore some of the consequences for both livelihoods and ecosystem services, and then draw out the main messages and consider the policy implications. And in some cases, I might also be referring to the climate crisis and also what we're seeing in South Africa at the moment in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic and South Africa's responses to this. In the next slide, I'd like to briefly introduce a framework that I've been using in my work to understand landscapes and livelihood change. I feel it's really important to look at what is happening in terms of field cultivation from a dynamic systems perspective. The systemic and dynamic view of local livelihoods and the landscapes and ecosystem services that people depend on starts by recognizing multiple drivers of change over both temporal and spatial scales, as you can see in the left-hand side of this figure. These drivers cause changes in interlinked landscape and livelihood systems, the green bubble in the middle. The outcome of these changes are influenced by history of the area, the local social, ecological and economic context, as well as social differentiation. So, for example, who you are and the assets you have can determine the types of outcomes from the changes. These outcomes in turn influence the trajectories that livelihoods are taking. In South Africa at the moment, many people in rural areas are actually stuck or in a trap, or losing out or spiraling down. And what we really need to be thinking about is how to move that situation into one where people are able to step up or step out. And this really requires fundamental transformation, and we'll talk about that a little later in the talk. And also there's no single pathway to this. There's no one solution in terms of really making people's livelihoods in the rural areas of South Africa more resilient and sustainable. This framework, used by Sheona Shackleton and colleagues in a paper published in Land Use Policy, shows the systemic relationships between drivers, again across scales, how they influence field deactivation, and then the multiple outcomes from that, again at local, national, international scales. These consequences in turn can feed back into the drivers and again further affect field deactivation. And there are some examples of this that I'll show as I go through my talk. So I'll now move on to some of the empirical evidence. So what are the types of land use changes that we're seeing? This slide shows the results of an aerial photograph analysis in the Gatshana area of the Wild Coast in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. The two aerial photographs on the side here, the first one from 1942 and the second one from 2009, show how dramatically the landscape has changed. If we look at the graph, which looks at the changes between 1961 and 2009, we can see that the number of fields has declined and the number of old fields has increased. And correspondingly, we're seeing an increase in woody vegetation or woodland, as well as an increase in forests. This slide shows the same area, but going back to 1942. And again, we can see the same trends. So the decline in farming is leading to an increase in woody density as pioneer species invade those old fields. We're also seeing some invasive plants coming into the area, and this is resulting in a loss of grazing for livestock. But we're also seeing an increase in wild animals, particularly bush pigs and monkeys, who are raiding the remaining fields. There's also difficulty opening up these fields again because there's very high labour requirements to clear away the woody vegetation. And then people are also expressing some other concerns. For example, we can no longer walk through the fields because there are too many trees and it's dangerous. So there's this perception of increased crime that comes with the increasing woody density. This slide shows an aerial photograph analysis from a different part of the Eastern Cape. And again, we're seeing very much the same patterns, this decline in cultivated fields and an increase in woodlands, although to a lesser extent than on the Wild Coast. But what's interesting here is this dramatic drop in the cultivation of fields between 1967 and 1996, so quite a long time ago. And this is where we need to really understand the history of the area to understand the drivers behind this. This slide shows a similar analysis, but over a wider part of the country, including 4 of the previous Bantustan areas. And the period that was looked at was between the 1950s to 2010. And we can see the same types of trends. A decline in active fields over this period, as well as an increase in abandoned fields, to the extent that in some places the number of abandoned fields is beginning to overtake the number of cultivated fields. This slide shows a different methodology which uses paired fixed point photos over a period of time. And I like these pictures because they just show how dramatically these landscapes have changed. So in the earlier photographs, you can see fields, you can see quite low levels of woody vegetation, whereas in the later photographs, some of those fields have vanished altogether and the vegetation is beginning to look like a savanna. So looking at survey data, we see the same trend, although it can vary with context. So if we look at the table at the bottom of the slide, we can see in Fairburn, about half of those households who have fields are still cultivating, whereas in Limpopo, only about 16% are still cultivating. There are similar data to this from other parts of the country. The graph at the top just shows that a much higher proportion of households are cultivating home gardens than those that are cultivating fields. It's interesting to see who is involved in cultivation. The graph at the top, we can see that all household members are, including the children or the youth in the household, and this is particularly so where fields are still being cultivated. In the table at the bottom, we can see that higher income households tend to be more involved in cultivation than lower income households, primarily due to the costs involved. This slide shows the increase in garden cultivation in 2 different parts of the country, and we can see in the bottom graph that this has been quite substantial between 2005 and 2013. This type of cultivation is actually very important in food security, but tends to be little recognized in policy. This slide looks at exceptions to the trend, that field farming is still alive and some people are still very keenly farming those fields. So this is work from a survey that Paul Hebbink and myself did to see who was still farming and why they were farming. And so what we can see is there's several pathways or trajectories, and that some people continue to farm. There's been partial deactivation amongst some, people farming more in their home gardens, And in some cases, people have shifted entirely to purchasing their food. So there's more than a single story. And I think going forward, this is a really important understanding to have. So moving on now to look at some of the drivers of these changes. And I think it's important to note that many drivers are interlinked. It's a complex story and it differs from place to place. Going back to Gachana on the Wild Coast, we can see that very many different drivers have been responsible for the changes we have observed. These include socioeconomic drivers like urbanization and permanent migration, loss of jobs, place-based drivers like decline in livestock and therefore draft power, skewed population and labour concerns, more raiding wildlife, decline in extension services, and of course weather unpredictability and climate change. We also see changing perspectives and values and ambitions, and also changing family dynamics and fragmentation of families, which again can affect labour requirements. We're also seeing an erosion of social capital, particularly the collective practices or activities that people used for farming in the past. Also loss of natural resource management institutions, which can also have an impact. Crime and other maladaptive behaviour were also highlighted by people themselves, including the theft of cattle and crops and fences. So people say it's not worth putting up fences because they just get stolen. But probably most importantly, we're seeing the legacy of apartheid. So these areas are still neglected. There's no secure land rights and tenure. There's still very poor service delivery. There's poor levels of education. There's very minimal choices for people in terms of their livelihoods. And this situation we're seeing has been really amplified during the present time of the COVID-19 lockdown, where there's very high levels of hunger in the rural parts of the country. This slide is from a more global synthesis, but I'd like to point out some of the higher drivers of the deagrarianisation or field deactivation that we're seeing. This includes an urban bias in policy making, a lack of support to small-scale producers. In South Africa, we see programs come along, they don't work successfully, they go away and nothing replaces them. Also institutional and governance issues, insecure tenure, and sometimes inappropriate policies and programs to some contexts, such as a push for commercialization or intensification or monocrops or non-food crops, which could drive further inequality and could affect food diversity and security going forward. This set of drivers has come from past farmers and giving the reasons why they've stopped farming. Includes things like loss of draft power through death of cattle, but also environmental factors such as poor soils, unpredictable weather, lack of water. But what has also been recognised is alternative incomes, but also the fact that farming is very expensive and it may not be worth it, particularly because of these other high risks that I've just mentioned. This slide shows a human environmental timeline that's been collated from various sources of data. And again, the drivers of change as well as some of the consequences are very similar to what we're seeing in other parts of the country. This site was right up in northern Limpopo, close to the Zimbabwe border. I'm not going to say any more there, but the reference is there in case some of you would like to look at it. This slide here just shows how climate shocks are really important and that people are experiencing these often more frequently, and that this is a huge disincentive for agriculture. Also, I think it's important to note that climate change will not just affect food security through its impacts on local agriculture, but also through its effects on the global food system and the prices of purchased food. And for me, this is one of the big concerns going forward into a more climate uncertain future. I think local food self-sufficiency and food security is really important for resilient livelihoods going forward. So in the next set of slides, we're going to have a look at some of the parallel changes occurring in livelihoods, as well as some of the consequences of these changes for livelihood resilience. So this slide, based on Paul Hebbink and colleagues' work in the Eastern Cape, shows that these drivers of change have acted over a very long period of time to alter livelihood portfolios. So what we're seeing is a decline in agriculture in that graph, as well as an increase in social grants within the livelihood portfolio and a decrease in remittances. This slide presents livelihood portfolios across two different sites in the Eastern Cape, Lessington, which is peri-urban and inland, and Willowvale, which is really quite rural and coastal. I presented for female-only households. Those are female-headed households with no adult males in the household, who tend to be the most vulnerable in the community, and you can see have very low incomes. And the other extreme, which is the high-income households, that tend to be the least vulnerable in the community. Of course, there is overlap in a few of these, but not very many. What is really important to see is the overwhelming importance of social grants in the livelihood portfolio of all of those households, almost 50% or more of the livelihood portfolio. If we look at land-based activities, those can be seen in the little pop-out figure, and we can see this consists of cropping, natural resource harvesting, and livestock. Most important for the female-headed households is the natural resource use, whereas for the high-income households, livestock tend to be more important, including livestock sales for cash income. Crops in all of them are a very small percentage, around 1 to 3% of the livelihood portfolio on average. This slide here just shows very similar pattern across some 1,200 households across the communal areas of South Africa. So again, it's not unique to the Eastern Cape. The table in this slide is from a participatory focus group discussion and shows how the primary sources of income for households has changed over time. So if we look during the 1990s, formal employment was ranked number 1, while when the survey was done in 2015, this was replaced by government grants. The second most important previous source of income was from remittances, whereas in 2015, this was from the sales of fuelwood. What is also interesting is how gardens have now stepped up in their rank from number 7 to number 3. This slide presents mental maps done separately by men and women of the stresses and vulnerabilities that communities face in the Eastern Cape. It's interesting to see various references to farming, both crops and livestock, and how this is linked to other vulnerabilities in the community. People are concerned about what the loss of agriculture represents and what it means for their lives and how it's connected to other issues that they're facing. This table here considers sources of food for households in the Eastern Cape, and you can see that most people are saying they purchase their food. When asked whether this makes their lives harder or easier, many reported that it makes it harder for them, mainly because of the high costs to access food, which include both transport costs, often to distances that are quite far from their homes, having to pay for their shopping when they bring it back, whereas others mentioned they have no other option. For those who said it's easier, mostly this relates to the risks and costs of farming. Here we're also looking at sources of food for households, and you can see in the top table that most people are buying most of their food sources. In a few cases, we have households that might be growing some of their own vegetables and staples to complement what they purchase. If we look at the bottom table, what we can see is very few households are food secure, particularly in Limpopo, where some 58% of households are severely food insecure. This is a real concern going forward, and it's again what we're seeing reflected at the moment with the COVID-19 lockdown and very high levels of hunger in the rural areas. Here, I'd like to add another perspective on what the changes in the various components of the landscape mean, in particular the changes in the biodiversity of old fields with time, as you can see in the left-hand graph there. In some cases, the increase in useful products for people is providing an alternative source of livelihood and other in-kind contributions to the household. If you remember, The first set of pie charts I presented, I showed how women-headed households are very dependent on natural resources as an important local income source. This slide here illustrates the point I was making in the previous slide. Fuelwood sales have become an important source of income for young men in the village of Fairburn. You can see that now, well, in 2015, some 80% of households were purchasing their fuelwood. Reasons for this include increased grant income, particularly from child grants, that supported payment on consignment for wood delivered to the household, more wood in the landscape, and the need for income earning opportunities amongst the youth and their willingness to do door-to-door selling. Also, a factor more recently has been the increased costs of electricity and people turning back to using fuel wood for much of their cooking. Finally, I'd like to conclude with some key messages and policy implications, and I hope that some of these points will come up in the discussion during the webinar in a few days' time. So what are some of the key findings and implications? There's a real marked change in landscapes. This is not imagined, this is really happening, and it has social, economic and environmental implications. Overall, we could argue that rural livelihoods are becoming less secure and more uncertain, especially when we consider future under climate change. Food security is a major concern related to the trends we're observing. We're seeing more dependence on store-bought food, which is often less nutritious and of poorer quality. Mike Rogan, in work that he published in Development in Southern Africa, has reported that farming households experience less hunger, even though they might be poorer in terms of income. So this says rural agriculture is a really important safety net, particularly for food security. We've also seen that not everyone wants to be a farmer, or at least a commercial farmer, that livelihoods are diverse and people have different ambitions and ideas of what is work, and farming is just one of several sources of livelihood within the household. We're seeing both continuities and discontinuities and new directions in livelihoods. It's not a linear process. Sometimes people are going back to farming. We're also seeing farming and ecosystem service use continue in different forms, and we're seeing home gardening become more prevalent. Most importantly, people have different visions for the future, and this varies amongst social groups, with the youth often seeing things very differently to the older generation. We've also seen that old fields provide other products to households and can have other functions, and so they're not wastelands, and this is an important consideration. We've also seen that identity and culture continue to play a role in livelihoods, and can ask the question, could more understanding of this have a place in reinvigorating agriculture? We also need to better understand the interaction between drivers that can result in change and the factors that contribute to stagnation and how to overcome these. Certainly, the majority of households in the rural areas of South Africa could be considered to be in a poverty trap. What do we need to do to change this, to facilitate reactivation of cultivation and other livelihood choices? I'm not going to go into this slide, but just to show in a participatory visioning exercise of the future, the youth had some very different ideas to the elders and community leaders. In particular, they were catching on to new trends like solar energy projects or conservation agriculture or training of youth farmers. And so I think this is something that needs a lot more research. What are the youth really interested in doing, and are they interested in staying in the rural areas going forward? So what is needed for transformation in these rural areas? What do we need to do to set livelihoods on more sustainable trajectories and address the declining agricultural problem? We could argue that it requires a comprehensive multi-pronged approach. We need to be thinking about structural change and policies to support rural communal areas. We need to be thinking about improved basic services, alternative livelihood options, tenure security, enhanced landscape management, and new sustainable methods of farming. Water access, even if it's at a small scale through rainwater collection for households. Access to credit and inputs, and more social protection that could also be invested in agriculture. new markets and support of these. I'm hoping some of this we'll be able to look at more when we come to our webinar discussion. We also need to be recognising multiple pathways into the future. Not everyone is a farmer. Promoting numerous targeted solutions helps to recognise the values, needs and interests of different people and places. But at the same time, we need to pay consideration to vulnerability and inequality. So moving on to my last slide, regarding what is needed, we also need to be thinking about greater collaboration across different rural, agricultural and food value chain actors, including local farmers, in order to support smallholders better and to also find greater options for homestead gardeners. I'd just like to finish with this quote from a paper. If an enabling environment can be created where people are educated, healthy, live in communities with minimal crime and have tenure security and the rights to self-determination, they will be in a better position to consider the pros and cons of alternative livelihood options themselves, including the revigoration of agricultural production. This slide here is just for information. So I was involved in this global synthesis that looked at rural livelihoods, food security and rural transformation under climate change. And there was very much a focus on solutions and ways forward on rural agriculture and how this can be promoted in a time of huge uncertainty and greater risk. Finally, I'd just like to say thank you all for going through this presentation and listening to it in advance of the webinar, and I look forward to talking to you all on the 5th of May.